Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I am so honored to be here in the Potter's House. It is so exciting for me to be here today on this special day with these wonderful graduates. Bishop Jakes, I've been a long time admirer and fan, and I so appreciate your leadership. I appreciate this ministry, but I appreciate all of you for bringing me here for this very special occasion. There's a scripture I want us to reflect on as I speak, and it's found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And you all know this scripture. It's when Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he's talking about the challenges that he's facing, and he's humbled by this thorn in his flesh, and he's complaining about the difficulties he's having, and he's asked God 3 times to take the thorn away. And then Paul writes in chapter 9, he says, "And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." And then he says, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." And then in verse 10, he writes, "Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake." Because he says, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." You know, and sometimes we forget that the great apostle Paul was once the felon Saul. He was the person who wreaked havoc on the church, and he was persecuted and prosecuted for all of this havoc. He was a convicted criminal. And yet God transformed him into this great apostle. And I want us to reflect on that today. I am so thrilled that this community has begun a ministry for people who are dealing with convictions, people who are recovering from our criminal justice system. This church is modeling something for the entire faith community, and I'm so proud to see it here. I really am. We need to see this all over this country because there's a great need. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. There are 6 million people on probation or parole in this country. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they try to get jobs and they try to get loans, they're often disfavored by that arrest history. We've done some terrible things to women in the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, the percentage of women going to jails and prisons has increased 646%. The statistic that keeps me up latest at night, though, is the one that I have to share with you. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That was not true in the 20th century when many of us were born. It was not true in the 19th century. It has become true in the 21st century. And so we need ministry, we need intervention, we need to respond to this crisis that we are facing in this country. And I could spend all morning talking about the problems, but I really want to share a word that I think is rooted in solution. I've got 4 things to say to those believers who understand the power of redemption and grace for this community. There are 4 things I want to talk to you about. The first is, I believe that God's people are called to be proximate, to be close to those who have fallen down. I believe we are called to make a commitment to get proximate to those who are in jails and in prisons. We've got to make a commitment to get closer to the people and the places where they're suffering. You see, there's a lot of people who were taught their whole lives, if there's a bad part of town, if there are places in Dallas where the crime rates are high, where there's a lot of abuse, where there's a lot of neglect, where there's a lot of drug addiction and a lot of despair, many of us have been taught, stay as far away from those parts of town as possible. But I believe God is calling a people who are willing to do the opposite, or willing to get proximate to the poor and the abused and the neglected and the suffering. And I say that because I'm actually persuaded that there is power in proximity. When we get close to those who have been excluded, when we get close to those who have suffered, when we get close to those who have been incarcerated, when we get close to the condemned, we understand something about grace and power we can't understand from a distance. Got a lot of politicians coming up with solutions, and their solutions don't work because they're so far away from the problems, they can't see the details. You've got to get close to these problems to understand it. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. When I was a little boy, I had to go to the colored school. They didn't let black kids go to the public school. There were no high schools for black children in my county. When my dad was a teenager, he couldn't go to high school. And then one day these lawyers came into our community and they made them open up the public schools. And because they made them open up the public schools, I got to go to high school. I had the great privilege of going to college. I went to a Christian college, Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania. I loved college. I loved the environment. It was a wondrous place, and I'd never been any place like that. And when I got to college, I made the decision. I said, you know what? I love college so much, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in college. And I called my mom. I said, Mom, I've made a decision. I said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in college. My mom said, you know, I didn't go to college, Bryan, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. And I was a philosophy major, and when I became a senior, I'd go out on the hillside because I thought as a philosophy major, I was supposed to think these big, deep thoughts, and I was out there one day, and somebody came up to me and said, you know, you are a senior, and you are a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I started thinking about it, and I heard it as a hostile question because I realized nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. So I started looking into graduate school because nobody in my family had gone to school. I didn't know what I'm sure everybody here knows. I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science to get admitted to graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. I was very intimidated by that, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school. It became very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. You don't. And so I signed up for that, and a few months later found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School, deeply disillusioned. I was worried because they weren't talking about race, they weren't talking about poverty, they weren't talking about social inequality, and I thought, you know what, this isn't for me, and I kept struggling, and I couldn't find my way, and after 2 years, I was still struggling, and I was about to do this thing I'm going to pray all of you never do. I was about to do this thing where I tried to rationalize accepting a career as a lawyer that I knew would not fulfill me, that I knew was not my purpose, that I knew was not going to animate my life, but I was trying to persuade myself that's what you do. You just do the thing that you have to do, even if you don't feel excited about it. And then I got proximate. I took a course that required me to spend a month working with death row prisoners in Georgia. And I found this organization where these lawyers got up early in the morning, and they worked hard all day. They stayed up late at night. Their lives were animated by this work. And I'd been there a week when one of the lawyers said, we need you to go to death row and just explain to a man that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. I got in my car, I drove down there to death row, and I was nervous because I realized this man was going to be disappointed when he discovered that I was just a law student. And I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say, and they parked my car, and I went into the prison, and the prison was dark and intimidating, and the guards took me to the visitation room, and I was so nervous. And I kept pacing back and forth, and finally they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned man I'd ever seen. And what I remember about that man is that he was burdened with chains. He had handcuffs around his wrists. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. It took them 10 minutes to unchain this man. And I was standing there getting even more anxious, and finally they unchained him, and he walked over to me and he said, hi, my name is, and I just was so afraid. I said, I'm so sorry. I said, I'm just a law student. I said, I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about criminal procedure. I don't know anything about appellate procedure. I don't know anything about anything, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man stopped me. He said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you. He said, you are the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or death row guard. And then the man said, I've been calling my wife at night and I've been talking to my children, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife. I'm going to see my kids. He said, thank you. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, being proximate could have an impact on the quality of someone's life. That man and I started talking. It turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birth date, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I started asking him questions about his life, and we fell into this conversation. And quickly, 45 minutes turned into an hour. An hour turned into 2 hours. 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and we were still talking. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour. And the guards were getting angry that I was staying so long, but we were still talking. And after 3 hours, the guards couldn't bear it any longer. They came bursting into the room, and they were angry. They couldn't do anything to me, but they took it out on this man. They threw him against the wall. They pulled his arms behind him and they put the handcuffs back on his wrists. They wrapped the chain around his waist so tightly I could see him grimacing in pain. I begged them to be gentle. I said, look, it's my fault, not his fault. Please don't take it out on him. But they ignored me. Then they put the shackles back on his ankles. I could see the metal pinching his skin. The man was struggling. I said, please, please be gentler. It's not his fault, it's my fault. But the condemned man looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. They started shoving this man toward the door. He almost fell down, and I was watching in horror at the way they were treating him. They were pushing him so roughly, and they got him near the door. And then I watched this man do something. When they got him near the door, they were about to shove him out, but he planted his feet. And the next time when they shoved him, he didn't move. And then that man turned at me, and he looked at me and said, Bryan, don't you worry about this. You just come back. And then I stood there and watched that man do something I've never forgotten my whole life. I stood there and I watched him close his eyes. And then he threw his head back. And then he started to sing. And he started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. He said, new heights I'm gaining every day. He said, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. And everybody stopped, the guards stopped, and then they started resuming, pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could hear this man singing about higher ground. And all of a sudden, I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew that I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. I knew that my journey was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get to higher ground, I can't get to higher ground. And I'm telling you, there's power in proximity. When we get close to the incarcerated and the convicted, when we get close to the poor and the abused, when we get close to those who have been drug addicted, we get close to those who have been abused and neglected, we're going to find God's power manifesting itself in ways that you cannot imagine. And the church has to get closer to those who've been thrown away, those who've been beat down. There is power in proximity. But the second thing I think we've got to do is we can't just get close. We've got to bring something. We've got to change some of these narratives. You see, we've got all kinds of problems in America. We've made these policy choices. And we make these policy choices, but there's narratives. There are narratives behind the policy choices. We have mass incarceration in this country because we decided to deal with drug addiction and drug dependency as a crime issue rather than a health issue. You see, we could have said that drug addiction, that's a health problem. We need our doctors and our medical providers and our churches to wrap our arms around people who are struggling with addiction. But we didn't say that. We said it's a crime problem, and now we've put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons. Now, with alcoholism, we said, no, that's a health problem. That's a disease. And if we know somebody who's an alcoholic and we see them going to a bar, we would never think, let's call the police. But with drug addiction, we said, no, that's a crime problem. But the reason why we made that choice has to do with a narrative. I believe we've been too often corrupted by what I call the politics of fear and anger. We've got a lot of politicians who want us afraid and they want us angry. And the truth is that when you're afraid and anger, when you allow yourself to be governed in fear and anger, you'll tolerate abuse, you'll tolerate inequality, you'll tolerate injustice. And so we've got to change the narrative. You see, the church is not about fear and anger. The church is about hope and love. And when we represent hope and love, we change the narrative. We've got to change some of these narratives. It's about our children. We had some people going around 40 years ago saying that some children aren't children. They said that these kids may look like kids, they may act like kids. They said, but these are not children. They were mostly talking about black and brown kids. And they said, these kids aren't kids. They came up with a new word. They said, these aren't children. They said, these are, quote, super predators. That's the word they used. And they demonized a generation of children in every state in the country, lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. I have represented 9 and 10-year-old children facing decades in adult prisons. We've got 10,000 children in adult prisons right now. We've condemned 13 and 14-year-old kids to die in prison. And this narrative has to change. I worked on a case some years ago involving a 14-year-old boy. And this boy lived in a household where his mother would sometimes be the target of domestic violence. And one day the boy's mother, she had a boyfriend, and when this man would start drinking, he'd get violent, and the man came home. He'd been drinking, and he went into the kitchen, and he called the boy's mother in there, and he went up to her, and he just punched her in the face. She fell. She hit her head as she fell. She was on the floor bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running in to help his mother. He tried to get her to wake up. He tried to get her to respond, but he couldn't. And after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. Little boy got up and he went into the bedroom to call the police. And the man was in the bedroom snoring. And the little boy was going to call the police. He was going to get the phone, and then he remembered that the man kept a handgun in his dresser drawer. This child went over to the drawer, and he pulled out the gun, and he walked over to where the man was sleeping. And he tragically pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, the little boy panicked, and he pulled the trigger. He shot the man in the head, killed him almost instantly. Now, this little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He had a pretty decent school record. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as an adult, but for the fact the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they put him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother got me involved, and I went to the jail to see this little boy, and I was stunned at how terrified this child looked when he walked into the visitation room. And he sat down, and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he just sat there. And I put my pen down. I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. Little boy wouldn't say anything. I got up, and I walked around the table. I pulled my chair close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Little boy just staring at the wall. Couldn't figure out what to do, and at some point, I just leaned on him. I don't even know why, but I leaned on this little boy, and when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And that's when this little boy started to cry, and through his tears began talking to me, not about what happened with the man, not about what happened with his mom, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been sexually assaulted by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been, and I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm. I said, look, you stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And I will never forget that little boy grabbing me by the arm saying, please, please don't go. Please don't go. I said, no, it's okay. It's all right. We're going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And when I left that jail, the question I had in my mind is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We've allowed these narratives to emerge about some of our children. We've begun to think that some children aren't children. We've started throwing away children, and I believe the scriptures remind us and require us to recognize that all of God's children are children, that we cannot begin throwing away the children that are struggling. You see, I don't think we're going to be judged by how we treat specially talented children, the privileged children, the gifted children. You see, I think we're going to be judged by how we deal with the children that are dealing with trauma and poverty and abuse and neglect. That's where we show our love of the future. And we've got to change these narratives about what it means to stand with children suffering. We've got to change the narratives about poverty in this country. You see, I think we've got some problems that we've got to deal with. We've got a criminal justice system in this country that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And I believe God wants us to speak to that. God is about justice. I think we've got to talk about the problems of race. I mean, it's a hard thing to talk about, but the truth is we're not really free, and there are these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt that get assigned to certain kinds of people, and we've got to talk about this. We've got to change the narrative about race. You see, I don't think that the great evil of our history has been addressed. I think we're burdened by this history of racial inequality. It's like smog in the air. And even in the church, sometimes you see it manifesting itself. And I think we've got to talk about some things we haven't talked about. You see, we're living in a post-genocide society. You see, in this country, there was a genocide. Before white settlers came, there were native people here. And we killed that community. We rounded them up. We made them leave. And we haven't talked about it. We haven't done the things you're supposed to do. And that narrative of racial difference that was crafted during that era, you see, I think that was the true evil of American slavery. I don't think the great evil of slavery in America was involuntary servitude and forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference, this ideology we created that some people aren't good like other people. And you see that narrative of racial difference, that was the true evil. We said, oh no, these black people are different. They can't do this, they can't do that, they're not this, that, not that. And that narrative, that was the true evil. And if you read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. It talks about involuntary servitude, it talks about forced labor, and because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865, I think it just evolved. You see, whereas there was this period of time You know, we're not just in a slave state, we're in a lynching state. We had lynchings and terrorism all throughout this country. And it left these wounds that we've got to address. You see older people come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced. And that story is something we've got to address. You see, the black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, exiles from lynching. And then we had this heroic civil rights movement, and I think it's wonderful, but we haven't dealt with all the injuries. My parents were humiliated every day of their lives. They'd see those signs that said white and colored. They weren't directions, they were assaults, and we've got to address those injuries. And today, because we didn't do it, there's a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. Not everybody who ends up in jail or prison has done something wrong. Some people just are in this place where they're presumed dangerous and guilty, and we've got to change the narrative. I believe it. I was in court not too long ago. I had my suit and tie on. I was sitting at defense counsel's table. I was ready to do this hearing. And the judge walked in and he looked at me and he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. I don't want any defendants sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. I said, my name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. And then my client came in, a young white kid I was representing, and we did this hearing. But afterward, I was thinking, what is it when this judge saw a middle-aged black man in a suit and tie? It didn't even occur to him that's the lawyer. What that is this narrative of racial difference, and we've got to change the narrative. We do. In South Africa, you can't go there without learning about apartheid. If you go to Rwanda, they're going to make you understand the difficulties created by the genocide. If you go to Germany today, there are markers and monuments to reflect on the homes where Jewish families were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial, but in America, we're not talking about slavery. We're not talking about lynching. We're not talking about segregation. And we've got to change that. And I believe God calls us to be voices for justice, because until we eliminate this narrative of racial difference, we're going to see inequality. But changing the narrative is not enough. The third thing I'm persuaded we are called to do, we've got to get proximate, we've got to change narratives, but the third thing we've got to do is we've got to stay hopeful believers. You see, our hope is key. And I mean this because sometimes in the church we think that being faithful is the same thing as being hopeful. Sometimes it's easier to be faithful than hopeful. You can show up every Sunday and be hopeless about what you can do between Monday and Saturday. And what I'm talking about is staying hopeful. We've got to identify the things that make us hopeless, and we've got to fight back. We've got to prepare ourselves. We've got to stay ready. We've got to pray. We've got to be prepared to deal with it, because hope is key. You see, I think hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And when we become hopeless about what we can do to eliminate crime, to create equality, to put some of these folks out of the situations that give rise to incarceration, we're going to be part of the problem. And so God wants us to stay hopeful. I had the great privilege when I was a young lawyer meeting Rosa Parks. When I moved to Montgomery, a woman named Johnny Carr, the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott, called me up. She said, now, Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to town. I said, yes, I am. She said, well, my name is Johnny Carr. I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she said, if you're a young lawyer called to town, sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go some places and speak. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go some places and listen. And then she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. And so I said, yes, ma'am. And she would call me up and send me places to speak and listen. And one day she called me up, she said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. We're going to get together over at Virginia Durr's house and have a conversation. She said, do you want to come? I said, yes, I do. And I went over there and I listened to these amazing older women. They weren't talking about the things they had done. They were talking about the things they were still going to do. They had a hopefulness. They had a faith. They had a courage I could not shake. And after a few hours, Ms. Parks turned to me. She said, now, Bryan, tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And I gave her my whole rap. I said, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about excessive punishment. We're trying to do something about mass incarceration. We're trying to do something to help the poor. We're trying to do something about race. We're trying to do something to help people who are disabled. We're trying to do something about conditions of confinement. When I finished, Ms. Parks looked at me. She said, She said, that's going to make you tired, tired, tired. And that's when Miss Carr leaned forward and she put her finger up and she said, that's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave. It takes courage to stay hopeful. It does. But hope is what gets you to stand up when other people say sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people say be quiet. Your hope is key. But that won't be enough either. The fourth and final thing I am persuaded we have to do, we've got to get proximate. We've got to change narratives. We've got to stay hopeful. But the fourth thing we've got to be willing to do, believers, we've got to be willing to do uncomfortable things to create more hope. We do. And I hate saying it because we're human. And humans are programmed to seek comfort. Biologically, psychologically, we go to the things that make us comfortable, which means we have to make a choice to do uncomfortable things. And I hate talking about it because I know it's hard. And don't get me wrong, I'm not speaking against comfort. That's not what I'm saying. I gave a talk down in Mississippi. People met me at the airport. They said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We read your book. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. So we've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn. I said, what is wrong with y'all? I said, of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to position yourself in uncomfortable places and be a witness. I've been representing death row prisoners for some 30 years. I've had some wonderful moments. We've had a lot of people walk out free after being wrongly convicted. I've seen people wrongly condemned find their freedom. It's been glorious, but I will tell you, I've had some difficult days as well. A few years ago, we had a lot of executions in my state, and we made a commitment to represent anybody who didn't have a lawyer facing execution. And I got involved in a case where a man was facing execution in 30 days, and the man I learned was intellectually disabled. And I went to the courts and I said, you can't execute this man because he suffers from intellectual disability. Our courts have banned the execution of people with intellectual disability. But when I got to the court said, too late, should have been raised earlier. I said, no, it's not too late. The court said, no, it's too late. And the state court said too late. The appeals court said too late. The federal court said too late. And I found myself getting frustrated because on the day of the execution, we had not stopped the execution, and I was pacing back and forth in my office about an hour before the scheduled execution. And finally, the United States Supreme Court clerk called. And they told me that our motion for a stay of execution had been denied. Too late. And then I did the hardest thing I have to do in my work. I picked up the phone and I called this man to tell him, I said, I cannot stop this execution. I'm so sorry. And then that man did the thing that I fear most. That man started to cry. And then he started to sob. And through his tears, he said to me, he said, Mr. Stevenson, please don't hang up. He says, I've got something really important I got to tell you before this happens. I said, of course. And then that man tried to say something to me, but in addition to being intellectually disabled, he had another challenge. When he got nervous, when he got overwhelmed, he had a speech impediment and he would start to stutter, and all of a sudden he could not get out a single word. And he kept trying to say something, but he kept failing. And the harder this man tried to talk, the more he was just ripping my heart apart. And before I realized that, I was standing there holding the phone with tears running down my face, and he kept trying, and he couldn't get the words out. The guards were trying to speed him up, which just made it worse. And I was in agony. And all of a sudden, my mind wandered. I remembered when I was a little boy going to church one Sunday and being with my friends and talking and seeing a little skinny kid I'd never seen before. And this little boy wasn't saying anything. And I remembered on the night of this execution asking that little boy, I said, what's your name? Where are you from? And then I remembered how that little boy couldn't get his words out either. And he tried to respond to my question, and he couldn't get his words out. He stuttered terribly. And then I remembered doing something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mother saw me laughing at this little boy, and she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she came over and she pulled me by the arm and she pulled me aside. She said, Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that. And I tried to apologize. My mom said, no, Bryan, you know better than that. And then my mother looked at me. She said, now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and my mom grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. I kind of rolled my eyes, but I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and then she grabbed me by the arm again. She said, wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy I love him. And she gave me that look again. So I said, all right. And on the night of this execution, what I remembered was going over to that little boy and saying, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I remember lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remember trying to say to this child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, look, man, I don't know. I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then I remembered how he whispered flawlessly in my ear, he said, "I love you too." And I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out before this execution. And finally, the man got his words out. He said, "Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me." And then he said, "I want to thank you for fighting for me." And the last thing that condemned man said to me was, "Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life." He hung up the phone. He hung up the phone. They pulled him away. They strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone. I said, "I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. It's too hard. It's too uncomfortable." I was thinking about how broken he was. And I had this question I couldn't answer. And my question was, why do we want to kill all the broken people in this country? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to hurt it, we want to kill it? And then I realized that all of my clients are broken people. I represent the broken. My clients have been broken by poverty, broken by despair, broken by trauma, broken by drugs, broken by neglect, broken by abuse. And then I realized that I work in a broken system because the people who have power are often unwilling to get proximate. They're locked in narratives of fear and anger. They've lost their hope. They won't do uncomfortable things. And in that moment, I said, "You know what? I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. It's too much." And I sat down and I said, "I can't do it. Can't do it." And I was sitting there thinking, and I was just thinking, and then all of a sudden, I had this realization that I hadn't had before. All of a sudden, I began to realize something I hadn't thought about before. And what I realized shocked me. And what I realized is that I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. It was a shock to me. I realized why I do that night, what I do. I realized I don't do what I do because I've been trained as a lawyer. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I don't do what I do because it's about human rights. I don't do what I do because I get to go to court. I don't do what I do because somebody's got to do it. I realized that night something I'd never realized before. And what I realized is that I do what I do because I'm broken true. And the reality came to me, and I heard God saying, "My grace is sufficient." And then I realized that when I'm weak, that's when I'm strong. And then I began to understand some things about brokenness. And what I learned about brokenness is that broken people are the people that are really going to show us how grace works. It's the broken that will teach us how redemption works. It's the broken that can show us how compassion works. It's the broken that are going to lead us to that place of justice. I've often thought about the fact that if grace ever went on trial, if redemption was ever on trial and God needed an advocate, and he asked me to be his lawyer, it wouldn't be the rich and the powerful, it wouldn't be the theologians and the experts, the first people I'd call if I was prosecuting the case for grace, prosecuting the case for redemption. I'd be calling the TORI graduates of 2017. I'd be calling the incarcerated. I'd be calling the condemned. They would be my witnesses. I believe the church and the Gospels teach us some very simple things. I think the Gospels teach us that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Why they're saying I'm more than is because you're more than your offense. If somebody tells a lie, you're not just a liar. If you take something, you're not just a thief. Even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. God's grace means that you can be more than your crime, more than your work. And I believe through TORI and the Potter's House and Bishop Jakes, the Lord is putting forth a word, and the word has to do to this country the things that this country needs. I don't think that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I think we talk too much about money in America. I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we deconstruct these conditions. And finally, I believe that when the Lord comes and he's looking at our churches and our places of faith, he's not going to judge churches by how they treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. He's not going to judge them by how big or beautiful they are. He's going to judge them by how they treat the poor, the sick, and the incarcerated. And so my word to each of you, to you graduates, stay close to people of faith. Change these narratives. Don't lose your hope. Be willing to do uncomfortable things to experience the redemption and grace that God has for you. My last word is don't measure yourself the way the world wants to measure you. You see, they want to call you a formerly incarcerated person the rest of your life. They want to measure you by the offense you've committed, but don't let them do that to you. There's a different metric system for God's people. There's a different metric system what I'm talking about. There is. If you're in school, I want you to do well. I want you to study hard, but don't ever think that the grades you get are a measure of your capacity to change the world. I want you to have good jobs, but don't ever think that your income is a measure of your capacity to reflect God's grace. Don't ever think that. I'll end with this. I was giving a talk in a church, a little tiny church in West Alabama, and this older black man came into the back of the church. He was sitting in a wheelchair, and he was looking at me so stern and so angry. Couldn't figure out why is he looking at me like that. And I got through my talk, but that older black man kept sitting in the back just staring at me. And people came up, they were very nice and appropriate. But when everybody else left, this older man got a young kid to wheel him to the front of the church. And he came down the aisle of that church with this stern, angry look on his face. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And then the man asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back and I mumbled something. And then he asked me one more time. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then that older man looked at me. He said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." He said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know what was about to happen. But then this man grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, come here, young man. I'm going to show you something." And that man turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have here on the right side of my head?" He said, "I got that cut in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have down here?" I said, "I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. Got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts." He said, "They're not my bruises." He said, "These are not my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And you see, that's what God can do. You see, these beloved brothers and sisters, you've been cut, you've been scarred. Some of you have been marked by these histories. Some of you have been marked by these crimes. But today, the Potter's house is all around you. And we're converting your cuts and bruises and scars to medals of honor. And when we honor you, we honor God. And so for that, God bless you. Keep fighting. And I wish you all the very best. God bless you all.